It is Monday night, Parashat Vayetzei, and we have what may feel like a journey into the weeds. Um, Hopefully, we'll emerge from the weeds with a little bit of a method and some extra insight into the story of the chronology of Yaakov Avinu's life. Um, as usual, um, I think the by the end, hopefully, we'll see a compelling set of questions, some sort of gaps in the story, and some suggestions about how to pull them together. And either the answers are convincing or not, but I think they do point up some of the gaps in the questions of the story of Yaakov's life. Maybe an even more exaggerated version of these questions pertains to some of the chronology of Moshe's life and some, years along the way that are not part of the story. Um, so, with that vague introduction, let me share my screen and we'll begin. We're going to wade through a bunch of stuff here. Hope to make some sense of it. Okay, the essay is called Yaakov's Years in Haran, Chronologies and Chronographies. And here we go. When Yaakov, fleeing Lavan, is finally caught by his pursuer, this is towards the end of our Parashah, Parashat Vayetzei, who thereupon levels serious charges of theft against his son-in-law. Yaakov responds, "These 20 years have I been with you. Your ewes and your she-goats have not cast their young, nor have I eaten the rams of your flocks. I did not bring to you that which was torn by beasts. I bore that loss, and you required it of my hand, whether stolen by day or at night. Thus I was. In the day the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years have I been in your house. I served you 14 years for your two daughters, and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times." This statement of Yaakov, taken at face value, indicates that he arrives at Laban's door 20 years earlier. We're going to come back to this at the end, right? He opens up by saying, 20 years I've been with you. And then again, he says, 20 years I've been in your house, 14 years for you, two daughters, and 6 years for your flock. This is the basis for the chronology presented in Midrash Seder Olam, which the footnote here explains is a 3rd century Midrashic work, which frames events from creation to the end of the Second Temple period in a timeline. And it's used by a number of Rishonim in their comments on events in the Bible. And he'll sort of point out that the Midrashic work bases some of its assumptions on fixed dates and ages that one can find in the text of the Torah itself, and the other on hints and assumptions that are compelling but not confirmed by the text of the Tanakh. And this is always a challenge, to really try to wade through the text and see which ages and dates are factual, and which things we know confirmed taking the text at face value, and which things are gaps, and therefore, where are their assumptions. Midrash Seder Olam says, our forefather Yaakov was 63 years old when he was blessed, meaning when he got the bracha from Yitzchak, and at that time Yishmael died. As it says, now Esav saw that Yitzchak had blessed Yaakov, and that Yaakov listened to his father, and Esav saw that the daughters of Canaan did not please Yitzchak, so Esav went to Yishmael, this is the end of last week's Parsha, Parshat Toldot, and took unto the wives that he had, Machalat, the daughter of Yishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nevayot, Achot Nevayot, to be his wife, Lo Isha, or Al Nashav Lo Isha. There is no reason to add, this is the continuation of the text of Seder Olam, Midrash Seder Olam, there is no reason to add the sister of Nevayot. Why does it state the sister of Nevayot? Meaning we're told that Esav marries Machalat, the daughter of Yishmael, Abraham's son. And then it also tells us that Machalat is the daughter of Yishmael, Abraham's son, and that is the sister of Nevayot. What's the purpose of adding this relationship to an otherwise unknown figure, sister of Nevayot? Why did it state the sister of Nevayot? This teaches that Yishmael gave her in betrothal, meaning Yishmael gave Machalat, his daughter, in betrothal to Esav, and he died. And Nevayot, her brother, Yishmael's son, the brother of Machalat, married her off to Esav. In other words, Ishmael engages off his daughter to Esav. Then Ishmael dies, and that leaves it in the domain of Ishmael's son, Machalat's brother, to complete this commitment and marry off Machalat to Esav. Yaakov spent 14 years hiding and studying with Aver, and Aver died 2 years after Yaakov's descent to Aram Naharaim. He left there, Yaakov left there, and came to Aram Naharaim. So it turns out that when he was standing at the well, he was 77 years old. Okay, so remember, confirming the math from inside this midrash, Yaakov was 63 when he was blessed. At that time, Yishmael died, because it says right there that Esav marries Yishmael's daughter, the sister of Nevayot, and the implication of the inclusion of the sister of Nevayot is that Yishmael has just died and his son Nevayot has to marry off Machalat. Text doesn't say that, but that's the text, and that's the midrash's interpretation of why Nevayot is mentioned. So at age 63, when Yaakov receives the blessings, Yishmael dies at that time, and Yaakov leaves home at that time, fleeing from Esav. We're told that he spends 14 years hiding and studying with Aver. That takes it to 77. At that point, he leaves Aver and he goes to Laban's house at age 77. And he spent 20 years in Laban's house. Now, that is a text that we saw above, where Yaakov himself says, 20 years I've been with you. 7 before he married the matriarchs, another 7 after he married them, and 6 years after the 11 tribes and Dinah were born. Okay, so here we have, above we had 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock. And the Midrash is interpreting that as 7 years before he married the matriarchs, 7 years in which he married them and had all the children, and then the last 6 years after they were all born, because the text called that for the flock. So all of the tribes were born within a span of 7 years, except for Binyamin. Each one after just 7 months, right? If we got to get 11 tribes in Dinah, that's 12 births, and we have 7 years, that's 7 months per birth, ostensibly. He left Aram Naharaim and came to Sukkot and spent 18 months there, as it states in Yaakov traveled to Sukkot, and there's some discussion about the time that he spent there. He left Sukkot and came to Beit El and spent 6 months offering to God. In a later formulation of this midrash, the introductory line, why were Yishmael's years counted? Why was his lifespan of 137 years recorded? In order to associate the age of Yaakov. And the midrash continues, working on the presumption that Esav's wedding had to take place immediately after the death of Yishmael, due to the unusual mention of Nebayot, that's what the midrash mentioned above, making Yaakov and Esav 63 at the time. However, the subtle challenge to the midrash, which the Gemara explicates, leading to the contention that Yaakov spent 14 years studying with Aver, is based on this declaration of Yaakov's, along with a few other chronological data given to us by the text, meaning this declaration of Yaakov's being the one in which Yaakov says, I've been with you for 20 years. When we put those two things together, the 20-year tenure that Yaakov himself describes as having been his tenure in Laban's house, with the idea of the death of Yishmael at the time of receiving the blessings, is what's necessary to constrain the data to this structure of receiving the blessings at 63, but only arriving at Laban's house at age 77, and therefore having these 14 years hiding and studying with Aver. Okay, a lot to hold, but let's keep going. Rarely does the text of the Torah, even in sequential narratives such as Breshit, provide us with dates, ages, and time spans. Ages are nearly always given at a protagonist's death, but objective dates are never given, except in the case of the flood, with no way for us to understand which calendar is being referenced. I mean, the flood tells us, on X day of X month, but we don't know what the month starting point is. There's some confusion there. Time spans are only given when the duration of the event itself, such as the 40 and the 150 days of the flood, the 7 years of plenty, holds inherent significance to the story. Meaning usually we don't get the duration of things. We can, however, piece together some relational times based on the data given. In other words, here are some hard facts that we know by putting together pieces of information from the Torah. For instance, we know that Yitzhak was 37 when his mother died, since we are given her age of 90 at his birth and her age of 127 at her death, right? Sarah was 90 when Yitzhak was born. Sarah died at 127, so Yitzhak was 37 when his mother died. By the way, this leads some people to say that Yitzhak was 37 at the binding of Isaac because they connect the binding of Isaac and the death of Sarah, right? They interpret the juxtaposition of the story of the binding of Isaac with the beginning of the following week's portion, the death of Sarah, and quote Rashi, who says, when Sarah heard about the binding of Isaac, her soul left her and she died. That's not explicit in the Torah, that connection, and therefore we don't have to say that Yitzhak was 37 at the time of the Akedah. He could have been younger, and some more time could have passed after the Akedah before Sarah died. So the idea that Yitzhak was 37 at the Akedah is not confirmed by the text. But the idea that Yitzhak was 37 when Sarah died is confirmed by the text, because we know that she was 90 when he was born and she died at 127. He was 37 when she died. We know that Yitzhak was 14 years younger than Yishmael, since Abraham was 86 at the latter's birth and 100 at the former's, right? So that's another piece of hard fact that we have in the Torah, that Yishmael is 14 years older than Yitzhak. We also know that Esav and Yaakov were 60 years younger than their father, as the text explicitly relates. Right in the beginning of Parshat Toldot, it says, Yitzhak ben Shishim Shana beledet otam. Yitzhak was 60 when Yaakov and Esav were born. Therefore, Yaakov and Esav were 63 at the time of their uncle Yishmael's passing. Right. So if we put all these pieces of information together, we can confirm that Yaakov and Esav were 63 when Yishmael died. What the leap that the Midrash makes is that that's when the blessings were given. That we don't know for sure. This Midrash, however, is also based on working backwards from Yaakov's death to determine his age at the time of his arrival in Haran. We learn that he came to Egypt at the age of 130. That's explicit in the Torah. When he meets Paro, he's 130. We also know that Yosef had been in power for 9 years when Yaakov came down, since the 7 years of plenty began immediately upon his ascendance to the position of viceroy. Yaakov and the family descended to Egypt in the second or third year of the famine. We're also told that Yosef was 30 at the time of his rescue from prison and his being placed in charge of Egypt's salvation. Hence, Yosef was 39 when Yaakov came down at the age of 130. Therefore, Yaakov was 91 years of age when his favorite son was born. Okay, so facts that we have, Yaakov and Esav were 63 when Yishmael dies. Yaakov was 91 when Yosef was born. Those are kind of bookends to kind of this period, this potential period of Yaakov's time away. The interaction between Yaakov and Lavan immediately after the birth of Yosef indicates that this was the point when the 6 years for your flock began. Right, that's when, right after the birth of Yosef, is when they have their conflict and they set up this arrangement. Dating backwards, that means that Yaakov arrived in Laban's house 14 years earlier. And if we just said that Yaakov was 91 when Yosef was born, then Yaakov arrived in Laban's house when he was 77 years of age. Seder Olam begins with this as a given. But assuming that Esav's marriage to Machalat took place when he, and Yaakov, his twin brother, was 63, and Esav married Machalat after Yaakov's flight from Hebron, what happened to the 14 intervening years? This is where the Midrashic Academy of Shem and Aver plays a role and explains Yaakov's missing years. Parenthetically, this explanation is invoked chiefly to raise another point, that those 14 years of his study were not reckoned against Yaakov for his failure to honor his parents during that time, as opposed to the 22 post-academy years, for which he was held liable and therefore punished with poetic justice by having his beloved Yosef taken from him for 22 years, right? The idea that he had not, had left home and not been in touch with his parents for these 22 years, and therefore Yosef is away from him for 22 years, doesn't include the 14 that he was at the Academy of Shem Ve'ever, is the point that the Midrash wants to hold up. I see Bracha points out, yes, that 14 is Yad, reminding you of Yaakov grabbing hold of Esav's heel. Interesting. Nice. Okay. Um, good. This biochronography, however, leaves us with several unsettling problems. And again, by the way, just remind us that the Midrash is attached to the idea that, so again, let's just point out a couple of facts. Yaakov is 91 when Yosef was born, and he arrives in Laban's house 14 years earlier. That's based on this assumption of Yaakov describing the whole period of his time in Laban's house as 20 years, and the last 6 after Yosef was born. So his arrival would have been 14 years earlier when he's 77. What we're going to see, just pointing this in our heads, we're going to see that you don't have to read the duration of his time in Laban's house as a fixed, closed 20 years, but there might be some time in the middle, rather than putting time before he gets to Laban's house at the tent of Shem and Aver, or at the tent of Aver, which doesn't appear in the Torah anywhere. We could fill in some of the extra time in the period of time that he's in Laban's house, and we'll see how we read that into the text a little bit later. Parenthetically, okay, we said that part. Good. This biochronography leaves us with several unsettling problems. And here's where we get the interesting challenges to the Midrash's reading, which I think will point out why the Midrash seems entirely untenable. And then we have to figure out what to do, which assumptions we need to unpack or dismiss. First of all, we know that both Yitzchak and Esav married, in Esav's case for the first time, at age 40. We don't know how old Abraham was when he and Sarah wed, right? We only know that that he was 75 when they left and they were already married. We don't know how long they've been married before that. So all of our information about the family indicates 40 as the proper time to marry, right? Yitzchak and Esav each married when they were 40. We don't know how old Abraham was. So the dated ages for marriage that are known for the patriarchs is 40 years. If so, this is the first question we're going to ask, not the strongest. Why did Yaakov wait till he was nearly twice that age to even look for a wife, right? If we say he got the blessings at age 63, departed, and spent 14 years with Aver, then why did he spend all that time there? Why would he have waited to be 77 years old to go to Laban's house and look for a wife? And pass that double milestone before marrying, right? Because it was 7 years. The first 7 years were before he got married. He was working. So he was 84 when he married Leah. Second, when Yaakov and Laban begin their new arrangement after the birth of Yosef, the immediate division was made of spotted sheep versus those that were not spotted, the former going to Yaakov, the latter to Laban. In this story, in chapter 30, we read, and this is one of the most opaque passages in Bereshit to me, so shall my righteousness witness against me hereafter, when you come to look over my hire that is before you. Every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and dark among the sheep, that if found with me shall be counted stolen. And Laban said, behold, it might be according to your word. And he removed, that we were highlighting the ambiguous pronouns here. And he removed that day the he-goats that were streaked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white in it, and all the dark ones among the sheep, and gave them into the hand of his sons. And he set 3 days' journey between himself and Yaakov fed the rest of Laban's flocks. It would seem that the undefined pronoun he at the beginning of verse 35, the one who set 3 days' journey between himself and Yaakov, should refer to Laban, as he's the subject of both the previous as well as the following verse. This, however, is difficult on 2 counts. Why would Yaakov agree to entrust his flock to his hostile partner? Right, that Laban removed the he-goats that were streaked and spotted. If that's what Yaakov says is going to be his, right? The not streaked and spotted, if found with me, shall be counted stolen, means the streaked and spotted are going to belong to Yaakov. So why would Yaakov allow the streaked and spotted to be kept with Laban and Laban's sons? That's question number 1. And if Yaakov is to succeed in superbreeding his flock, this isn't something he would be able to do if they were entrusted to Laban and his sons. Besides this, it doesn't seem likely that Laban has sons at this point who are of an age to be entrusted with such a mission. When Yaakov first arrived in Haran, Rachel, the younger sister, was tending the flock. We learn why Leah was not out with the flock. She was evidently more feminine with soft eyes. But why was a girl tending the flock at all? This should have been a job for the brothers. Rather, the most straightforward read of the story is that Laban had only the 2 daughters when Yaakov arrived, and he intended to incorporate Yaakov into the family as a son. It was only with the later birth of sons and their anxiety about their inheritance that the acrimony in the household began. That said, the indefinite pronoun he must refer to Yaakov, and he entrusted his flock to his sons, right? So going back up here, Yaakov removed the he goats, etc., and entrusted them to his sons. And then when we come back to he set 3 days' journey between himself and Yaakov, that would have been Laban. So the indefinite pronoun he must refer to Yaakov, and he entrusted his flock to his sons. But following Seder Olam, even his eldest son could have been no older than 6 years old at this time. Remember, within those 20 years with Laban, the first 7 are not married. The next 7 is married and have the kids. So the kids could be no older than 6 years old at this time, since Yaakov wasn't married for the first 7 of the 14 years preceding this negotiation. Third, if the years are as given, then Reuven is not yet 13 when the family leaves Haran. Yet he and his younger brothers, not long afterwards, engage in negotiations with Hamor and his son Shechem, negotiations replete with duplicity and deception on behalf of the clan. While this is possible, it's hardly plausible that the Chivites would agree to an arrangement made by the young sons of a patriarch, right, who are under bar mitzvah age, without the latter's explicit confirmation. Why would you deal with minor children alone and not their father? Fourth, in that same story, Shimon and Levi, who are approximately 13 and 14, together massacre all the men of that city, ultimately killing everyone and pillaging the town. Again, not impossible, but highly unlikely. Fifth, by the time Yaakov and his family make it back to Hebron, which per Seder Olam is within 2 years of the flight from Haran, Reuven has already engaged in his sexually inappropriate relationship with Bilhah. Regardless of how we understand what took place between them, this is the action of an older son intent on supplanting his father as head of the clan. Again, hardly a likely act of a 14-year-old boy, right? So all these stories that occupy, the latter half of Vayetzei and the beginning of Vayishlach, according to the order of the Midrash, happen when the tribes, the sons of Yaakov, are too young for it to make sense. And I think when we read them, we naturally assume that they must be young adults or adults already, but the Midrash and its arrangement of the order reads that as not possible. Sixth, why is Yosef identified when we first meet him in the context of his unpleasant fraternal relations, as this is the beginning of Parshat Vayeshev, the Ben Zukunim of Yaakov? The phrase simply translated means son of his old age. But according to Seder Olam, Yosef must be less than a year younger than his closest sibling, Dinah, and not all that much younger than any of his brothers, right? They were all born in succession in this 7-year stretch. Why call him a son of his old age? The seventh and final challenge is the most compelling. How could Yaakov have fathered so many children in such a compact time period? Let's look at the givens of the text. Yaakov worked for 7 years before marrying anyone. At the beginning of his 8th year in Laban's house, he married Leah, and a week later Rachel, right? That's all explicit in the text. Each of these sisters brought a handmaid into the household. There were 11 children born before Yosef, 10 sons and Dinah. None of these children were twins. There were no overlapping pregnancies, right? That would have made the story much smoother. But when you read the story in Vayetzei, it's chronological. One child is born, and then conception and the next child is born. It was only after Leah had 4 children that Rachel presented Bilhah, her handmaid, to Yaakov in order to be built through her. Leah then presented her handmaid Zilpah to Yaakov to continue having children for her. Only after all of this did the mandrakes incident take place, which led to the birth of Leah's last 3 children. After all these births, God remembered Rachel and Yosef was born. Seder Olam's timeline presumes several necessary birth details, some of which are plausible and some not. Premise 1, there were no miscarriages, especially on Leah's part, certainly plausible. Premise 2, right, in the assumption that all the children are born within the 7-year period with 7-month gestations. Premise 2, Leah became pregnant fairly immediately after the marriage, again, certainly plausible. Premise 3, Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah became pregnant fairly immediately after giving birth, highly implausible, especially in Leah's case. Premise 4, each pregnancy was 7 months long. This is stated explicitly in Seder Olam, again, highly implausible. Here is a chart of how the births would have taken place in Laban's house per Seder Olam's presentation of those years. We have years, you can look through it, going through the math and progression of the 20 years, and then these last 2 that the Midrash mentions, and how many years and months along each of these births would have happened. Seder Olam's chronology rests on two necessary assumptions. One, Esav's marriage to Machalat took place immediately after Yaakov left. Two, the mention of Machalat's older brother means that Esav married just after Yishmael died, i.e. at age 63. Okay, that was all the construction and the challenges, the Midrash's accounting of everything. Now we're going to come back to the text and suggest a different reading. Let's revisit the text. At the end of chapter 26, which, as we pointed out above, chiefly took place before the birth of the twins, there is a brief note, at the end of chapter 26, there's a brief note about Esav marrying two women at the age of 40. We're just going to jump to the text for a minute. This is last week's Parashah Toldot, right? So we have this long story in chapter 26. We talked about it last week of Yitzchak and Rivka going down to Abimelech and Gerar. And at the end of that section, we're told that when Esav was 40, he married Yehudit and Basmat, and they were a source of bitterness to Yitzchak and Rivka. So at the end of chapter 26, which took place, as we said above, chiefly before the birth of the twins, right? Because when we go on, we see, as we discussed last week, the idea that this whole long story in chapter 26 of Yitzchak and Rivka going down to Abimelech. Remember, we discussed this last week. What would they have done with their children? The Ramban says they passed them off as, belonging to others because Yitzchak calls Rivka his sister. How would that have made sense if they had, children with them? And therefore, Rabbi Shalom last week argued that this whole story actually took place before the birth of Yaakov and Esav. Right. So the end of chapter 26, which, as we pointed out above, chiefly took place before the birth of the twins. There's a brief note about Esav marrying two women at the age of 40, right? So that obviously happens after the birth of the twins, right? So it's after the bulk of the story in chapter 26, which happens before the birth of Yaakov and Esav. Then we have this little postscript about Esav being 40 years old and marrying these two wives. There's a brief note about Esav marrying two women at the age of 40. As we pointed out in the previous chapter, these two verses jump ahead to bridge the birth, growth, sale of birthright narrative in chapter 25 with the blessing narrative in chapter 27. These women, we are told, were the source of great bitterness of spirit to Yitzchak and Rivka. After a break of a Parashah Petucha, right? So we see here at the end of chapter 26, we have this, little opening, this little chapter break. We are informed that Yitzchak was old and his eyes were failing. And that leads, of course, to the story of the stolen blessing and Yaakov's flight to Haran. It's clear that Yitzchak's blindness was not an indicator of an end-of-life scenario, though that is what he thought, right? He says, I don't know when I'm going to die, but let me bless you before I die. Even if we interpret his old age as 123, when Yishmael was 137 and died, he still lived nearly 60 more years. I mean, even if we take the Midrash at its face value, that the blessings were given juxtaposed to the death of Yishmael. Yishmael is 137. Yitzchak is 14 years younger. That makes him 123. Even if we assume that, he still has many more years to live. He still lives nearly 60 more years because he lives to 180. We could just as easily understand Yitzchak's blindness as coming directly after Esav's marriages, right? Because that's what's juxtaposed there, right? Esav was 40, and then Yitzchak was old and his eyes were too dim to see. So rather than taking the Midrash's assumption that this story, Yitzchak being too old and his eyes too dim to see, happens when he's 123, let's assume it happens much more closely on the heels of Esav being 40 and taking these wives. And if we know that Yitzchak was 60 when Yaakov and Esav were born, so if Esav is 40 when he gets married, Yitzchak is now 100. If we allow for a few years, now this is for example's sake, right? As he's going to say, this term that I just learned from this essay, arguendo, for argument's sake, right? If we allow for a few years before Yitzchak's reaction to his daughters-in-law, in other words, right, we see that Esav marries these women and they're a source of bitterness to Yitzchak and Rivka. Well, maybe they weren't a source of bitterness on day one. Took some time. Eventually, they were frustrated and unhappy. That was a number of years after the marriage, which was when Esav was 60 and therefore Yitzchak was 100. So if we assume a number of years pass before Yitzchak's reaction to his daughters-in-law, We may posit Esav and Yaakov at, for argument's sake, 48 years of age. Again, give or take, you could add 5, subtract 5, no significant difference. Yaakov's continued bachelorhood is not as surprising, right? If he's now we're arguing that at the time of the blessings, Yaakov and Esav are 48 instead of 63. So Yaakov's continued bachelorhood is not as surprising, considering that Esav marrying first would be the expected norm, right? Note Laban's comments to Yaakov when Laban says, we don't, give the younger before the older. The older is supposed to get married first. So we can understand Yaakov not getting married before Esav. So Yaakov being a bachelor at age 48, only 8 years after his older brother married, is not surprising. After the sour taste of Esav's marriages to local girls, it's not hard to understand why Yaakov would wait a bit longer to marry. We will yet return to Esav's third marriage and the possible allusion to his being 63 at the time. Let us presume that the theft of the blessings took place when Esav and Yaakov were 48, again, as opposed to the Midrash assuming 63, or 15 years off now, and that subsequently Yaakov fled to Haran at mother's behest and with father's blessing. No 14 years in Aver's academy, as the Midrash assumes. Father's directive to marry a girl from the old homestead is reasonable against the background of Esav's recent marriages to locals. Yaakov arrives, say, at age 49 and works for 7 years to marry Rachel, putting him another 7 years behind in his responsibility to raise a family. However, as a man on the run with no immediate hope of building an estate, he wasn't in a position to marry and support a wife and children without the arrangement with Laban. At age 56, he then married what turned out to be Leah. A week later, he married Rachel, and thus began the next stage of his life as a married man. At this point, he owed Laban 7 years of work to pay up for Rachel's hand, which would mean that he would be 63 years old when he would be completely free of his debt to Laban. Consider that, beginning at 56, when Rachel was around 12 years old, now this is instead of 84, when he would be starting to have his children. If the blessings were, according to the Midrash, at 63, and then he spent his 14 years in Aver's academy, it takes him to 77, and the first 7 years of work before he gets married, taking him to 84, he's beginning his family at 84, instead, his children at 84, instead, he's 56. Consider that beginning at 56, when Rachel was around 12 years old, the customary age for girls to marry throughout the known world in the biblical period. That's not proven in the text, he's just assuming that age. Yaakov begins to sire children at a normal rate, perhaps one every 2 years. The only wife having children during these 7 years was Leah, and Judah was perhaps born after the 7 years were up. In the meantime, the rest of the birthing sequences play out over the course of the next 10 years or so. Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, which would make Rachel still barren, over 30 years old at the time. When Reuven, by now a young adult, brings his mother the mandrakes, Rachel desires them and sells her night with Yaakov for them. Again, a story that's explicit in the text. This leads to the births of Yisachar, Zevulun, and Dinah, all born of Leah herself close to her 40th birthday. Time passes. Rachel grows older, watching Leah's children grow up with the couplets born of her own Bilhah and Leah's Zilpah, and her alienation and pain increase. At this point, God remembers her, and she finally becomes pregnant at the advanced age of around 45, and Yosef was born. Yaakov, at this point, was 91. Remember, that's a fixed date based only on the text and no assumptions. He began his family at 56. Now he's 91. The 91 is a confirmed biblical date. We can now review our questions above and respond in order. Yaakov did not delay starting a family any more than necessary. As a result of Esav's bad wives and then his having to flee, he was stuck with Laban's offer and put off starting a family for an additional 7 years. By the time that Yaakov and Laban made their new arrangement after the birth of Yosef, his eldest sons were young adults, certainly capable of herding Yaakov's flocks. Right? That's Yaakov's eldest sons. In a similar fashion, the third, fourth, and fifth questions are answered. The older boys, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, were young men when Yaakov left, right? In their mid-20s. So their negotiations with Shechem and Hamor, the massacre of the town by Shimon and Levi, and Reuven's actions with Bilhah are all the actions of young adults. We understand why Yosef and later Binyamin is called a Ben Zikunim, or Yeled Zikunim, son of his old age. Yosef was indeed quite a bit younger than his other siblings. And of course, we see that the births did not need happen with the implausibly tight timing presented above. The children were each brought to full term, properly nursed and raised before the mother moved to another pregnancy. If this smoother read of the text is indeed valid, right? Okay, so now we put the midrash on the side for a minute and attempting to, having worked through the text, arguing a smooth reading of the text all the way through, with Yaakov, with the blessings around age 48 for Yaakov and Esav, then the journey straight to Laban's house, the 7 years of work, starting the family at age 56 and ending with the birth of Yosef at age 91. If this smoother read of the text is indeed valid, how do we explain Yaakov's behavior in Haran? To wit, he spent 14 years working for Laban to pay off his debt of 2 daughters as his wives. He spent another 6 years working in a strained partnership with Laban to build up his estate and prepare for return to Canaan. That was the whole deal with the spotted and speckled sheep. What was he doing during those intervening years? Meaning between age 70, when the 14 years, between age 63 or so, when his arriving at 49 and finishing his 14 years for his 2 wives. So between age 63 and from there, age 77 or so, right, hold on, 91 when Yosef was born, the last 6 years, 85 or so, right, to 85 or so, those intervening years. What was he doing during those intervening years? What was he doing when Naphtali was born, when Reuven found the mandrakes, when Dinah was named? Truth to tell, there's a larger question looming behind the entire narrative of Yaakov in Haran. Remember, the other issue we're dealing with is that in Yaakov's speech, he says 20 years in Laban's house, but this makes it sound like from the start of his arrival in Laban's house at age 49 to the end of his time in Laban's house at age 91 is much more than 20 years. We have to fit that into the text. We're going to come back to that, but we also just have to ask the question, what was he doing during that time? Okay, truth be told, there's a larger question looming about the narrative of Yaakov and Haran. He originally left for 2 reasons. To flee his brother's wrath at Rivka's urging. That was the end of last week's Parsha. Rivka tells him, I hear that Esav wants to kill you, run away and just protect yourself in Laban's house. And to marry a daughter of Laban at father's directive, because Rivka tells Yitzchak, these daughters of Chet are driving me crazy. I don't want Yaakov to marry one of them. So Yitzchak comes to Yaakov and says, go to Laban's house and find a wife, right? So he left for 2 reasons, fleeing his brother's wrath and to marry a daughter of Laban. When he had accomplished both after 14 years, he should have returned forthwith to Canaan, right? He fled and he married, and now he has his 2 wives, and 14 years have passed. He's around 70 years old. He's around 63 years old. He should come home. However, he had 2 other things to consider: whether Esav's anger had really subsided, and whether he had more to accomplish in Haran. Rivka had instructed him to flee to Haran, and she promised to summon him and bring him back when his brother's fury was spent and he no longer planned to kill his younger twin. We never hear of her summoning her son. This is a big discussion in the commentaries, leaving Yaakov with 3 possible explanations. Why hasn't he heard from Rivka? Either Esav is still mad, right? She said, I'm going to send for you when your brother doesn't want to kill you anymore. So if he still hasn't heard from Rivka after the 14 years when he's completed his marriage task and trying to figure out if he should come home, if he still hasn't heard from Rivka, there's 3 possible explanations. Esav is still mad, so she hasn't sent for him. Rivka has passed away, so she's not there to send for him. Or she wants him to stay there to accomplish something more than he has thus far. It's a hard one exactly to wrap your hands around, but okay, she didn't send for him because she has some other vision of when he's supposed to come home. None of these conclusions would motivate him to leave. If Esav is still mad, he must stay away. If his mother has passed away, he would be going back to a situation worse than the one he left, with Esav possibly still angry and his protector gone. If she wants him to remain and has something else for him to accomplish, again, this is a fuzzy one, that is what he must do. So in not having heard from her, he doesn't have a compelling reason to go back. I'd like to suggest that Yaakov remained in Haran, either working as a herdsman for himself or for others. I mean, he finished his 14 years. He's in the process of having children, and he doesn't have a compelling reason to return. So he's finished his debt to Lavan, and he continues in Haran as a herdsman. Note that the text ignores Lavan from the moment of the second wedding until the birth of Yosef. So we needn't assume that he was working in Lavan's estate the entire time. Again, he was waiting for a message from his mother that it was time to return to Canaan. Again, so much of the conditions of everything leading up to his departure was about relying on his mother. I'm adding this here, right? He didn't even want to do this, but she encouraged him to do it, and she said, anything that will befall you will be upon me. So she tells him then flee. So he's kind of dependent on her. That's the context of how their relationship and their parting leaves things. So he's waiting to hear from her. With the birth of a son, but again, not to say that he couldn't exercise agency, but Rav Shalom is also pointing out the reasons why he would feel motivated to return home, he doesn't have security about either. So he doesn't have a word from her, and he doesn't have a reason to go home. Again, he could do it, but he doesn't have a good argument for why he should. With the birth of a son by Rachel, finally, he returned to Lavan and negotiated a separation agreement whereby he would be able to take his share of the wealth that his hard work had brought to Lavan's household. From this point on, he worked with Laban for 6 years, keeping their flocks separate and finding ways to have his flocks multiply in astounding ways. Right? So his argument is, did the first 14 years, in principle, could have gone back, but hadn't heard from his mother, and all the reasons why that could have been are reasons why he shouldn't return yet. And so he made his livelihood and kept building his family there in Haran. He hadn't had a child with Rachel yet. When he finally did, that made him say, okay, now I can start to think about going home, and but I have to build up a final sort of security and the state, and he does that over these last 6 years. What are we to make of Yaakov's words with which we began our inquiry, right? So now we've made arguments about why the flow of the story and Yaakov's choices make sense. Now we have to fit it back into the original text that talks about the 20 years. These 20 years have I been with you. Your ewes and your she-goats have not cast your young, nor have I eaten the rams of your flocks. This is what we read at the beginning. I didn't bring to you that which was torn by beasts. I bore that loss, and you required it of my hand, whether stolen by day or by night. Thus I was in the day the drought consumed me, the frost by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years have I been in your house. I served you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock, and you have changed my wages 10 times. Note that in Yaakov's speech, he makes 2 separate mentions of his 20 years with Laban. These 20 years have I been with you, at the beginning of his response and defense, and these 20 years have I been in your house. I served you for 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flock at the end. Some have suggested that this means that there were 2 separate periods of 20 years, 20 working for or with Laban, and 20 working alongside him. This explains away much of the difficulties we encountered, right? If this text really means 40 total years with Laban. However, the repeated 20 years might rather form an inclusio. This is Rav Shalom using a usual literary technique, not a reference to a separate time period. The simplest way to read Yaakov's words is this. As he begins his defense, he points out that there have been 20 years of working loyally for Laban. This is Yaakov pointing out his work ethic, his honesty, and his forthrightness regarding his charges, right? Because he goes on to talk about all the ways he was faithful. At the end, he delineates that these 20 years were broken into 2 interrupted segments. 14 years for your daughters, that's from when he arrived for the next 14 years, and much later, after the intervening period when he's out there as a herdsman for himself or working for others, after that period elapses, then a final 6 years for your flock, right? First 14 for your daughters, and then 6 for your flock. Hence, Yaakov's words reflect a clear amount of years during which Yaakov, in 2 separate stages, was working in Laban's estate, with an unknown amount of years between them, during which Yaakov was working to take care of his family. I'll read the afterword and then make just a couple of comments about what feel like loose ends to me. One of the critical tools we have in our study of narrative is the ability to step back from the text and imagine the story unfolding. As we watch it before our eyes, we can see which events make sense and which strain credulity. If challenging, we look for textual clues that may help us out. Perhaps we are reading about a miraculous occurrence, which we would expect would be noted explicitly by the text. In lieu of that, we may have to look for another way to understand the text that helps us ground it in a reality that we, the people of the book, understand to be a part of human and Jewish history. I would have loved for him to come back and say more about um, why he thinks the Midrash is motivated to read the way it does, given that it forces so many challenging readings. He does say a little bit about that when he says that, he thinks that that's in part to explain the focus, the 14 years in Aver's academy is there to sort of explain why, after being away for so long, he only has the 22 years of reciprocal distance from Yosef or Yosef from him. It may also serve the purpose, the Midrash, of developing and prioritizing the idea of Torah study for the patriarchs, right? One of the ideas that the rabbis really like is that the patriarchs observe the whole Torah, study Torah, and so developing a period of time of intensive Torah study, 14 years, especially multiple of 7, lots of rabbinic stories about extended periods in the academy, Rabbi Akiva going away to study Torah for multiple units of 7 years. So there's something compelling, given the same data. It seems to me that the Midrash, less interested with scientific accuracy about how long, pregnancies last and the age of the sons of Yaakov for the future narratives. The Midrash is more preoccupied with building up Yaakov's character as a student of Torah and reducing the period for which he needs to have the reciprocal distance from Yosef. That seems to be what's driving the Midrash, and that's its priority. I think what Rav Echelon is introducing is, for those who are reared on Midrash, how to ask constructive questions about it, notice the same gaps in the text that the Midrash is noticing, try for a more, practical, reasonably grounded interpretation, then see where that bumps up against friction in the text, like the 20 years period, if actually, to make sense of the story, Yaakov really was in Aram Naharaim, in Laban's, orbit, for more like, 30, 40 years or so. Then how do we explain that 20 years? We need to come up with a different reading of the text, which he's able to defend, I think, very well. And so, it's the invitation to fill in the gaps plausibly, make good readings of the text out of it, and then puzzle out why a midrash would take a different approach. So while it's very much in the weeds, what I appreciate about it is the desire to help the Torah make sense and help the lives of the matriarchs and patriarchs make sense, be relatable, and it's an argument for the coherence of the Torah text, and also that there are pieces of the narrative, large stretches of time, which are missing, and we want to make our best character development guess about what's happening during them and why. So again, while it involves a lot of details and things that may feel, small and minutia, I think the commitment to the close and careful reading and constructing a narrative that fills in the gaps and understanding, what it is and why, I think is like a noble pursuit. And I don't always have the patience for it. And I appreciate that Rav Echelon does this work and presents this to us. I hope it was followable, and happy to hear just questions, thoughts, or reactions as always. We're all like, Lance, I can always count on you.
Um, could you show me in this essay references to God?
Great question. Uh, don't think so.
I don't think so either. And I think that's indicative of one of the major problems in understanding the Torah and what the Torah is supposed to be about. Now, if you read, I'm sure you're not familiar with Merchant of Venice, Act 1, Scene 3, because
Tell me.
there Shylock alludes to, guess what? The Jacobean incident of the spotted sheep.
Wow. Awesome.
And he goes through this thing, describes it to Antonio, who is a Christian. And you know what Antonio says? Jacob did this because God enabled him to do it. Guess
Mm,
what? If you look at Joseph, the key moment, two moments in Joseph, three moments maybe, are when Joseph says to the um, kids that basically threw him into the pit, "It's not your fault. God did it.
mm-hmm,
God did it in order
mm-hmm.
for me to get to where I am. There's an upward arc." And if you go through Genesis, you go through the whole Torah, you go through Tanakh, all these things, you will see that God enables the prophets. My favorite story, of course, is the one I mentioned earlier, which is about Elisha and the Shunammite woman and the regeneration of the dead boy. And of course, that's done
Yes.
only because God enables Elisha to do it. I'm also reminded, very interestingly enough, of a poem by John Donne. Go and catch a falling star, get with child a mandrake root. Tell me where all pastures are, or who cleft the devil's foot, and find what wind serves to advance an honest mind. Now that poem is about doing impossible things. And from my point of view, anyway, it's a satirical attack on fiction. But fiction, in the final analysis, is a paradox. And the paradox of fiction is that we read these stories and we actually get involved with characters and we're moved by them. It's black and white on a page, for example. There's nothing there. And yet, to us, there is something there. It's
Sure.
real. Um, of course, uh, it sort of bothers me that there's no reference to God here because of the episode of the spotted sheep, for one
Yeah,
thing.
A bit of
yeah.
genetic engineering there.
Right, right.
That
Lots
always
of analyses.
fascinated me.
Yes, lots of analyses of that story. Rav Meidan had one that I don't recall that we looked at a number of years ago, attempting to get grounded in something scientific and strategic. But yes, thank you. I think it's a fascinating point, and I wonder if it is the longest stretch in Genesis and Breshit without mention of God. I'm trying to remember, if there is one tucked in that we're not thinking of, but I think you're absolutely right that it's a sort of there's a different feel. I mean, God pops up in certain stories along the way, obviously is mentioned many times in the birth of the children, but in sort of the sections that he lived, right? As I think about it more, God is certainly not absent in these stories. Um, praying to God for the birth of the children and referencing God and naming the children. So it's kind of noteworthy that God doesn't feature in the excerpts that Rav Shalom introduces here in calculating the dates, because God is definitely not absent through this stretch of text. But yeah, thank you. James?
Does the he doesn't try to account for then matching up Yaakov's missing period with Yosef's missing period, right? Because then Yaakov's missing period is like 40 odd years away from Yitzchak.
Yes, yes. I think he's totally un not uninterested, but not compelled by the.
Uncoupling those two ideas.
Yes, yes. He's not bothered, exactly. He's not bothered by the fact that there's not a correspondence between the amount of time that Yaakov kind of, without being immersed in Torah study, leaves home, and the amount of time that Yosef is away from Yaakov. Yeah,
And,
good
and
point.
then he never really answers why Yaakov doesn't go back home. I mean, he answers for like in that middle time where he was like in limbo, but like ultimately he never goes home.
Well,
Right.
there was not good feeling between father and son there because of the Kedah, right? There was maybe a strained feeling over all these years
Between who and who,
between
Peter?
Isaac and his son. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
maybe he didn't really want to see his father again.
Yaakov didn't want to see Yitzchak, you're saying?
Yitzchak, yes.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right. I mean, it's hard to see how that, I can't initially see how that's connected to the Akedah, unless we just sort of posit Yitzchak having gone through the Akedah struggles with parent-child relationships. Um, but if you're referring to the blessings issue, that certainly could have created strain
Yeah, the
between
blessing
Yaakov.
also.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
A question about the mandrakes. What were they supposed to do? Was like a additional fecundity for women, or
Yes,
what? Is that what?
some type of fertility plant in that mandrake story, I think, is
Oh,
generally what's understood there.
okay.
Yeah. So just coming back to what James said at the end, yeah. See, it's as always, you have good close reading and good catches about sort of what's not fully addressed, and yeah, sort of the question of when he comes back to what actually does after arguing why Yaakov wouldn't have come home after all this time, then the explanation of why he actually does come home is kind of light. He just sort of says, with the birth of a son by Rachel, he finally returned to Lavan and negotiated a separation agreement whereby he would be able to take his share of the wealth. So there's just some sense he was waiting for the birth of a child with Rachel, and then he's ready to go home. But again, how did that address the factors that
Well,
nothing obviously has
Those
changed
those
in that?
those three reasons he stated are still
Still
there.
potentially operable,
Yeah.
100%.
but he didn't. He actually escaped. He didn't really say goodbye. He just kind of left, right?
Right, right. But why did he decide to go home at that point when
Okay,
he
yeah.
hadn't, when he hadn't previously? Yeah. Moshe?
I'm just curious. You said Jacob was punished. Yaakov was punished because for 22 years he didn't visit his parents. Okay, and you know, and what about Joseph? How many years was there separation between? It was also 22 years between Joseph
Mm-hmm.
and how come Joseph wasn't punished? Later on.
Mm.
And also, I mean, how were they supposed to send out a message? That
Yeah.
they didn't have telephones, email, telegraphs.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, these are outstanding questions I don't have good answers to. I think it's a really interesting run, right? If Yosef if Yosef is the corresponding um, you know, measure for measure to Yaakov, should that then cycle to the next generation
Right.
or not is an interesting question.
But
Uh,
Joseph he had a lot of power in Egypt. You could have sent a messenger. Hey,
right,
I'm here.
right,
I'm doing good.
right,
There's
right,
all
Come on
kinds of
down.
ways.
right,
Come on down.
right. And Moshe is also asking, what does he get as a consequence for that corresponding in his next generation? Yeah, interesting question.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
we it would be interesting to speculate. I wonder if there are any midrashim about this. Um, what winds up to. I mean, he certainly stays connected to his own children, to Menashe and Ephraim, but we don't hear much about their relationship. Was there something that happened there? Is it something to think about? Um, so yeah, good questions, and each could be many essays in their own right.
Yeah.
But yeah, so just in closing, again, I feel like I have to defend to some degree the slightly boring feeling to this essay, and I do really want to make the argument that different parts of Torah um, will appeal to us in different ways, and some of the essays and some of the questions will draw us in more or less. And I guess I want to say, even if this isn't the part that speaks to you, I think an appreciation for the busy, more than busy work, but the real unpacking, the kind of the respect that's accorded to the Torah here in attempting to make all the math work, account for the gaps, understand why a midrash would fill in a gap one way, what the challenges are with that, and propose an alternative filling in the gap and attempt to read it clearly into the text. I think is a noble endeavor, whether it's the ones where we would choose to invest our time or not. Leela?
It is very interesting. I just
I
want to point.
Hello. Sorry.
Yes, Leela, go ahead.
No, I mean, I didn't find it boring, so I'm sorry if I gave that impression
No, wasn't assuming your stance. I
in
was just,
my
I
slightly
feel it a little bit.
terse earlier comment. Sorry. But it's more that I felt really stupid when I read it. It's like I just couldn't, I'm like, why don't I understand what he's getting at? I just couldn't. I'm like, why is he even talking about this? So I
Yes.
felt not bored, but maybe just stupid.
Yeah,
Frankly.
I say you are. Let me first, you know, reject that possibility out of hand. Not your feeling, but the truth of it. But I think, I would say two things. One, I do think that in sometimes in his terseness, he's not as clear a writer. He skips a step here or there, or tightens things in a way that's not always so clear. I did experience that. I also read this three times and found that, only in the second or third time, and something's still not 100%, that I feel like the transition or the kind of next step of the essay was made clear. I definitely felt that it sort of reads through undifferentiated, but there really are important, division markers and clarifications. Where are we up to in the argumentation? So I definitely felt that the essay wasn't as clear as it could have been, and his writing always is a little bit more, making some jumps or making some assumptions. I think and I agree with you also, in terms of scaffolding, he doesn't really lay out as well as he does in some of the other essays. The title was Chronologies and Chronographies, didn't sort of give us a programmatic intro. What's the point of chronologies? What are we meant to get from them? How do we
Yeah.
analyze them? He sprinkled some things in along the way, but he didn't lay it out as clearly. So I think there's or some limitations or shortcomings in the essay. I think that's absolutely true.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter, were you going to make a last comment before we wrap up?
No, just an overall thing that's still very interesting. Very
Yes.
interesting to listen to. So,
Yes.
it is not boring at all. It's very interesting. And a lot of new insights that I never figured,
Great.
in a plain reading.
Great.
So thank you.
Absolutely.
One quick question. Does the Medrash ever talk about the years when Moses was in Medina?
Say it again.
Does the Medrash ever talk about the years when Moses was in Medina and how many years?
In Midian, yes.
Oh, Midian, yes.
Yes, I don't remember. I'm sure that there are midrashim about it. I remember there is a medieval commentary. Yeah, I don't remember if it's the Ibn Ezra or someone else who has a kind of a fascinating comment about like the adventures of Moshe in Midian, and kind of like this, it gives us a little glimpse into these unaccounted decades and what he was up to. I wish I could remember off the top of my head, but if I find it again, I'll send it around to the group on email, because I think it's another example of this, and it would be interesting to see if the midrash has a different framing. I don't remember the midrashic explanations about those missing years, but I'll try to find something and send it if I remember.
Yeah.
Before we sign off, just take a moment to look at the calendar for next week, while wishing everyone a wonderful Thanksgiving. Let's see, next Monday, the 1st. I do see I have something potentially on the calendar that evening, so we'll send out an email to confirm the time. Hopefully we'll be able to meet, and anyone who's local in Riverdale, it's not too late to join the bite for Thanksgiving. Oh, something from Dad?
Yes. So it was brought up about Moshe that there are missing years in his story, and I had heard that he didn't spend the years in Midian. Before he got to Midian, he went to Ethiopia, to Cush, and that comes out later when Aaron and Miriam criticize him. So.
Oh, really? I never heard
that might be it. Yeah, I might be misremembering. That might be it. I'll see what I can dig up and share it on email.
And if I remember correctly, in Cecil B. DeMore's the Ten Commandments, there's a scene there where Moshe is with I don't know, the king of Ethiopia or something. There's
Really?
somewhere he must have read the same midrash.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Good source
Movies
for
as
movies.
Midrash. We've got plenty of that. Prince of
just
Egypt
remember
and
that.
others.
Just remember this: the book is better than the movie.
Yeah, because 100%, 100%. All right. Happy Thanksgiving to all, and
Thank
great
you.
rest of the week. Love to mom and dad,
Bye-bye.
and see everybody soon. Take care.
Thank
All right.
you.
Sure. You bet.
Laila Tov.
Lila.